Okay, so let's discuss a few lab concepts here. And perfect. And then we'll get into a little bit of labeling. We'll kind of take it easy. I don't want to break anybody's brains. All right, a couple things when we're talking about bioorganisms, living things, all right? There's several properties. Some of the important ones are responsiveness, regulation, and reproduction, okay? We talked about a little bit about responsiveness because when we were talking about our homeostasis, all right, or homeostatic balance, all right, it requires a certain level of responsiveness to stimuli, and then basically how we react to that stimuli, right? And as long as we have a system, an organism that is in homeostasis, all right, then our responsiveness should be at adequate or acceptable levels, all right? But organisms that are failing to respond to certain stimuli can actually cause issues, all right, that can endanger that specific organism, all right? So one of the properties that we see, all right, that is vitally important is responsiveness. Regulation, again, dealing with that homeostasis there, all right, requires an ample or proper amount of regulation because there's all these functions that are occurring in our bodies, right? They're going on right now. Perfect example is the use of magnesium. Magnesium is a vitally important electrolyte. It's used in about 600 reactions in your body. That blows my mind. Blows my mind that 600 reactions. I never thought that magnesium was important, but it is. And the point is, if you're deficient in magnesium, it's going to compromise certain regulations and certain functions. And when those functions are compromised, you'll fall out of homeostasis. You'll be in a homeostatic imbalance, and then that's when you're going to jeopardize yourself and enter a state of disease or pathology can occur. Okay, so regulation is vitally important. And of course, finally, is reproduction. Okay, so obviously, when we discuss reproduction, it's going to be the production of new cells, whether it is for growing during our adolescence, all right, when we're in our teenage years and even our early adult years, or if we have a damage to a certain tissue or cell, all right, we need to repair that, or just everyday upkeep and maintenance there, all right? So when we're dealing with our gametes, our sex cells, then when we discuss reproduction, now we're going to talk about the actual creation or the development of a whole new organism, all right? And again, you get to talk about that more so in detail in Bio 211. All right, so we talked about this before, all right? So you already saw this, the levels of organization. We're always going to start off with the simplest level, which is going to be the chemical level, and that's going to be in chapter 2. And then we're going to move down in complexity down to the organismal level, and that's going to be us as a whole. So if you want to see a pretty cool picture of that, here you can see, okay? So here you can see we're going to be dealing with atoms and molecules, all right? And then you can see the progression up to macromolecules. If you're not sure what a macromolecule is, a protein's a macromolecule. Carbohydrates a macromolecule. Fat is a macromolecule. Okay, so we'll discuss macromolecules. Then we're going to get into the organelles, which are these tiny little organs. I shouldn't say organs, but these tiny little structures inside of our cells. Okay, so your cell, like your body, has little structures inside that help with certain cell processes. Right, and we call some of those little structures organelles. And then we'll talk about the cell as a whole. That's when we're in chapter 4. Okay, and then we get to the tissue level. All right, when we grab a whole bunch of cells that are similar to one another, and they start to perform a similar function or common function, that's gonna be chapter 5. And then when we start to add tissues to one another, they can be different types of tissues, then we're gonna wind up with an organ. All right, so we're gonna move through this throughout the semester, but we're gonna start with the first 4-6 weeks. We're going to be talking about the basics, all right? So I need to build up your foundation. So I like this slide because numbers 1 through 4 are what we talk about this semester. 5 through 11 is what you get to talk about in Bio 211. Okay, so everything above the line is Bio 210, and everything below is Bio 211. So it doesn't seem like much. The integumentary system is the skin, skeletal system, muscular system, and the nervous system. But the nervous system is quite vast. So there's several chapters on that. Okay. So get excited, get pumped. All right. So here's just some pictures of the different organ systems. Some that we'll talk about, most you'll talk about next semester. So let's start off with some basic terminology. And when we're getting to lab, we need you to understand a very, very important position in which we call the anatomic position. It's a reference position. So you'll hear me refer to the anatomical right or the anatomical left. And what I'm referring to is the anatomic position, which we'll talk about here in a moment. I'll show you a picture of it here. All right. But the anatomic position is basically someone is going to be standing upright, okay, with both feet flat on the floor, facing straight in front of them. All right. Their arms are going to be at their sides with the palms facing forward. All right. Another word for the forward position is anteriorly. Anterior is the front, posterior is the back. So the palms face anteriorly. All right. The head is level, meaning it's not looking up, it's not looking down, it's looking straight ahead. And same with the eyes, they're looking forward. I'll show you a picture of the anatomical position here in a moment, okay, when we start to do some of the labeling. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this reference stance, all right, and we're going to cut it up, all right, into sections and planes or slices, all right. So the two types of slices that we're going to discuss are sections and planes. So when we do a section, we're going to slice through, all right, our person, all right, and we're going to see the internal part. So we can see parts of the internal anatomy. All right, a plane is going to be this flat surface that's going to pass through the body. And there's three types that we're going to discuss. All right, well, actually, we're going to talk more than three, all right, but there's three important ones that I'm going to use in this course. The first one is called the coronal, or you can say the frontal plane. Either or is acceptable. But the coronal or frontal plane is going to divide the body into front and back parts. Or, and you can't say front or back, you got to use the anatomical terms. It's going to divide it into the anterior and posterior parts, front and back. If we're going to use a transverse plane or a cross-sectional plane, all right, this is basically like cutting somebody in half, like the magicians when they saw the lady in half sort of thing. All right, so this plane is going to divide the body into a superior, which is the top portion, and an inferior, which is the bottom portion. Okay, so it's going to divide the body into superior and inferior parts. Again, I'll show you a picture here in a moment. And then our last plane, okay, there's three listed here, all right, but they're all pretty similar to one another, is the midsagittal plane. The midsagittal plane, also known as the median. And if you've done statistics, when we have a median value, it's the exact midline of a range of numbers, okay? So midsagittal, all right, this plane is going to divide the body into, this is important, equal left and right halves. Equal left and right halves. Whereas a sagittal plane, all right, this is important that you know this, is going to be parallel to the midsagittal plane. Okay, but it's going to divide the body into unequal portions. All right. So a sagittal plane is going to be on either side of our midsagittal plane. And so therefore, it's going to divide the body into unequal portions. And then an oblique plane is going to just pass through the body at a specific angle. It can be at a 45-degree angle, 37-degree angle. It's just going to pass through the body at an angle. And I'll show you these pictures here when we get to the identification portion. So don't worry, I'm just trying to go through the definitions real fast here. Okay, so this picture here kind of gives you an example. You can see all the different types of planes. All right, you can see the mid-sagittal plane, all right, is dividing the body into, all right, equal halves here. Here's the right half, here's the left half. The coronal plane, again, is cutting the body into the anterior portion in the front, posterior portion in the back. And then our transverse planes, like sawing the lady in half, superior, inferior, okay? And so a lot of these planes, it's important because if you're thinking about going into imaging, all right, if you want to be able to look at an MRI or a CT scan, I mean, look at these pictures here. I mean, here you can see the coronal section of the skull. All right, and so it's dividing the skull into anterior, posterior portions here. The mid-sagittal, this is directly down the center of the skull. Okay, it gives you a great view here of the internal structures in the skull, the brain, and whatnot. And then here's our transverse section. So again, it's helpful to have that understanding if you're going to go into any type of imaging. All right, so here you can see some three-dimensional cuts and sections through the large intestine here, right? And it's just showing you different ways of looking at it. All right, so of course, if you're going to be taking anatomy, you've got to know some of the directional terms. And this is where terminology comes into play. If you've taken medical terminology, awesome, good for you. That's great. It's going to make things a little bit easier here because I am going to expect that you use anatomical terms. All right, I'm taking this class is anatomy and physiology, so you need to be able to use these terms here. And we've paired them up, opposing terms, meaning, all right, they're opposite of one another. Anterior and posterior, front and back, dorsal, ventral, proximal, and distal. All right, I'm going to show you what these mean. All right, so on this first one here, you can see we got the arrow pointing to the front of the guy and the arrow pointing to the back. I can guarantee you, you will have this on your test. All right, you'll see a picture of this on the test or something similar, and you'll have to be able to identify it. All right, so the arrow is pointing towards the front, that's anterior. If it's pointing towards the back, that's posterior. If you see the arrow pointing up towards the guy's head, they're saying that's referring to this, that's superior, going to the upper half, inferior, going down towards the feet. Both the arrows are pointing to the middle. See this line that's going through the middle? That's the mid-sagittal plane. Both the arrows are pointing towards the mid-sagittal plane, so that means it's medial. Okay? The umbilicus, which is the belly button, that's medial. All right? So now in this picture here, here's the mid-sagittal plane again. You can see the arrows pointing away, out towards the shoulders. Okay, so if we're at the umbilicus again, the belly button, these arrows are pointing away from the belly button or away from the sternum, your chest bone here. All right, they're going out to the sides. That's lateral. All right. These arrows are pointing from the palms of the hands up towards the armpit or the shoulders, and that's proximal. That means we're going from an area away from here, right here. I'm circling what's known as the axial portion of your body, which is the trunk, the head, and the neck. So those arrows are pointing from the limbs towards the trunk. That's referred to the proximal position. All right, that means, for example, I can say that my elbow is closer to my armpit than my hand. So my elbow is proximal to my armpit. Okay, now these arrows are pointing away in this next one here. And so those arrows that are pointing away, they're going from the shoulder out towards the hand. That's distal, or from the hip down towards the foot. All right, distal is far away from the trunk. Okay, and I'll get into the more anatomical terms for just trunk. All right, there's more terms there. All right, so in lecture we talked about regional anatomy and how there's certain parts of the body, certain regions. All right, and we break the gross anatomy down into that. And so when we discuss regional anatomy for this course, we're going to be using these two regions mostly when we study the skeleton and then the muscles of the skeleton. Okay, so you have the axial region, and you just saw me circle that on the previous slide here. Okay, that's what I'm referring to when I say the trunk. I'm referring to what I just circled here. Okay, so the axial region, is going to be the head, neck, and trunk. That includes your chest and your abdominopelvic region. Or another way to look at it is, all right, you have the appendicular region, which is made up of your limbs. Appendicular refers to appendages. So easy, you want an easy way to remember this? Appendicular region is your arms and your legs. Your axial is everything else. It's what your arms and legs attach to. All right, keep it easy. Not keep it easy, keep it simple. If you're familiar with the KISS principle, all right, the KISS principle, not the band with Gene Simmons, with the guy with the tongue, all right? KISS stands for keep it simple. I say silly because I don't like saying stupid to the students, okay? So keep it simple. That's what I'm saying. You don't want to make things more complicated. So the appendicular region is going to be the upper and lower extremities, your arms and legs, axial region, everything else, okay? And that forms what we call the vertical axis of the body. We'll get more into that when we get into the skeleton. All right, so these regional terms, you need to know these because I'm going to tell you this right now, and I'm not going to go over all these. This is something that you're going to do on your own, okay? You're going to memorize all these. You need to, because there's going to be probably anywhere from 2 to 4 test questions on your lab exam that mentions this. It'll put this guy up there, just like this, and you'll have an arrow pointing to one of these areas here. And you're not going to write head, all right? You're going to write cephalic, okay? You're not going to write mouth. You're going to write oral. Right? You're not going to write anything that's in parentheses. You're going to write the other stuff that's not in parentheses. So when we talk about the lower extremities here, all right, what we used to call the thigh, you're going to call that the femoral region. Okay, so I need you to go through these on your own. This is something you can use flashcards or whatnot. This is in your book, in your textbook here. Okay, so it's going to really help you to understand a lot of the anatomy there. All right, so you're going to do that, I would say, over the weekend as quickly as you can. Now I want to get into something where some students have some issues with, the body cavities and the membranes of these body cavities. All right, so the body cavities are where we are going to find all of our internal organs. All right. And so we name these body cavities pretty much according to the structures that they cover or surround. All right, so we'll get into that here in a moment. So let's break it down. All right, you have our body cavities are broken down into 2 groups. The first one is called the posterior aspect. The other one is called the ventral cavity. All right. The posterior aspect, posterior means back. So this body cavity is going to be more towards your back. The ventral cavity is going to be more anterior. Ventral, all right, is similar, all right, to anterior. I'm not going to write it out anterior because it'll take me forever with this. And it looks like that. It looks awful. All right. If you've ever looked at fish, like a shark, you've heard of the dorsal fin. I'm sure of you. I'm sure that you've heard. The dorsal fin is on the back of the shark. So dorsal is going to be posterior. Okay. So ventral is anterior, it's on the front. And dorsal is posterior, it's on the back. All right. So let's start off with the posterior aspect. I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to come right back to this slide. All right. So here you can see the posterior aspect right here. It's made up of the cranial cavity, which is basically that space where your brain sits. And it's also made up of what we call the vertebral canal. So the cranial cavity is covered by all the cranial bones of your skull. And the vertebral canal is going to be surrounded by the vertebrae. All right. So what is in the cranial cavity? Your brain. What is in the vertebral canal? Your spinal cord. Both your brain and your spinal cord make up the central nervous system. So this posterior aspect, all right, is going to house your central nervous system. And you need to know this, it is completely encased in bone. Okay? So skull and your spine make up the posterior aspect. So we subdivide the posterior aspect into the cranial cavity. All right, that's where the brain lives. And then the other subdivision is the vertebral canal, which is made up of all the bones, what we call vertebrae. We'll learn about that when we do the skeleton. All right, and what lives in there? The spinal cord. Your spinal cord and your brain make up, and you need to know this because we're going to learn it again later on, the central nervous system. That is one of the control centers. Remember we said the nervous system and the endocrine system are control centers. Well, your central nervous system is part of the control center there. All right. So let's talk about the ventral cavity. Okay, it's a larger cavity. Where is it found? In the front. Ventral means front or anterior. Okay, it is not completely encased in bone. So we subdivide the ventral cavity, all right, into two subcavities. You have the thoracic cavity, which is pretty much your chest, all right, and that's going to be the top portion or the superior portion. And then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, all right, which is going to be down by your abdomen, okay, below your rib cage. That's going to be inferior. All right, let me show you quickly on a picture here. So here's the ventral cavity, and you can see we've subdivided it into the thoracic cavity, which is colored blue, right? And then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is, I don't know, red and pink or whatever. Okay. We further subdivide the abdominal pelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Easy to remember. Put your hands on your hips. The cavity that's below your hips, or your hands, I should say, that's the pelvic cavity. All right. And then anything above your hands up to your diaphragm or where your rib cage starts, that's going to be the abdominal cavity. All right, so you can look here on the picture. This is the side view, and then you can see it from the front view here. Here is the abdominal cavity. Okay, your hip bones are right here, here, and here. And here's your pelvic cavity. Okay, so we subdivide the abdominal pelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And then you can see here, we subdivide the thoracic cavity into three, all right, subcavities. The mediastinum, which is basically this column-like structure here, right in the center. So if you feel on yourself where your sternum is, and that's that chest bone, okay, the mediastinum is directly behind that. We'll talk more about the mediastinum in a bit. On either side of the mediastinum, you have what's called the pleural cavity, and that's where your lungs live. And then, of course, right behind, all right, also behind your sternum there, your chest bone, you have your pericardial cavity, and that's where the heart lives. Okay, so all these cavities that I've just mentioned to you are lined by a membrane. A membrane is a covering, and there's 4 membranes in your body, and we're going to talk about 3 of them this semester throughout the semester. The first one, which is we're going to talk about now, is called the serous membrane. All right. Then in chapter 9, we'll talk about the synovial membrane, which is the lining of some of your joints, like your knees, your knuckles. All right. Then you have in chapter 6, the largest organ in your body, okay, which is called the integument, which is your skin, but it also has another name called the cutaneous membrane. That's the 3rd membrane. And then finally, the 4th membrane, which we'll talk more about in 211, is the mucous membrane. But we're all familiar with the mucous membrane because when your nose starts to run, it's because the mucus glands there are producing that mucus. Okay, so let's talk about these body cavities, the membranes that line them. Okay, So in these cavities here, we'll have these serous membranes, and these serous membranes are made up of 2 layers of tissue, or cells, I should say. Okay, 2 layers, 2. Let me start with the second one here, the visceral layer. Another name for the organs in your body is viscera. Okay, liver is viscera. Okay, your heart is viscera. Your large and small intestines, all viscera, those are organs. Okay, so the layer that covers these organs, okay, the outside of these organs, is called the visceral layer. So that makes sense. Keep it easy, keep it simple. Okay, so the visceral layer covers the viscera, which is the external or outside surface of the organs. And then the layer that goes on top of that layer is called the parietal layer. And in this case, the parietal layer is going to line the internal surface of the body wall. I'll show you what that means here in a moment, okay? All right, so you have 2 layers. So in between these layers, you will have a cavity, a space, and we call that the serous cavity. Now, it's important that you know this because in that cavity, all right, the cells will produce a fluid that fills that cavity, that space. And we refer to that as serous fluid. And it's important that you know this, but its job is to act as a lubricant. You don't have to, but I'm going to. I'm going to rub my hands together. And I'm going to keep rubbing them together as I'm talking to you. All right. As I'm rubbing my hands together, I notice that my hands are getting warm. Okay. And the reason for that is it's because of the friction that's occurring between these 2 surfaces. Okay. And friction causes heat. Heat can cause damage. Friction can also in itself cause damage. Well, guess what? That serous fluid lubricates those surfaces and it reduces that friction, which is good. Because think about it. If you were running along, if you're a marathon runner, think about what your organs are doing inside your body. They're moving around. As you're running, they bounce around inside you. And so when those organs brush against things, it will create friction. If that serous fluid wasn't there, your organs would heat up tremendously. And in some cases, you would have a significant amount of damage to those tissues here. So this serous fluid helps reduce that, all right, that friction, all right, which decreases that potential for damage. Very important. So a good example that I like to show folks when we're talking about body cavities and the membranes here, right, is the example of taking a balloon and pushing or pressing your fist into the balloon. I want you to think of the fist, all right, as the organ, okay? And this dark blue line that you see, that's the balloon itself, that's covering the fist, that is going to be the visceral layer of our serous membrane. So imagine the fist to be the heart, for example, okay? And so that layer that covers the fist, all right, that's the visceral layer. And then you can see this outer dark blue line. I want you to think of that as the parietal layer. And then that light blue area in between these 2 black, or not black lines, but dark blue lines, all right, there's a space there. That's where the air of the balloon is. Well, that's going to be our serous cavity. And that's where we'll find, all right, that fluid, that serous fluid that's being produced, okay? Great example. I like to use that to help explain some things. All right, so going back to our spaces here, all right, here you can see that mediastinum, and it's a median space, which means if it's a median space, it's directly dead center in the thoracic cavity. All right, I call it a columnar space, which means it just looks like a big column. All right. And so you need to know what's found in the mediastinum. The heart, okay, obviously, because that's in the middle. Well, it's off to the left a little bit, but it's still part of that's going to be in the mediastinum. The thymus, which is an important gland that you get to learn about when you do the immune system, okay? But the thymus sits right above the heart. The esophagus and the trachea. Esophagus is the tube that connects your throat to your stomach. The trachea does the same thing, connects your throat to your lungs. And then some of the major blood vessels that come from the heart and to the heart. Okay, that's what you'll find in the mediastinum. All right, another body cavity is the pericardium. Cardium, all right, I want you to think of heart, cardiovascular. Again, the pericardium is a two-layered serous membrane. The layer that is on the outside of the heart, it actually makes the external surface to the heart. That's the visceral. Remember, the heart is viscera. It's an organ. That's the visceral pericardium. Okay? That's this guy right here. That's the visceral pericardium if this is going to be our heart. All right? Then you have the pericardial cavity that is on the outside of the visceral pericardium. And then the outermost layer is the parietal pericardium. This is going to form that sac around the heart. So going back to our balloon, all right, that's this outer dark blue line. That's the parietal pericardium, okay, which forms, look at it, this balloon is the sac, okay? Then of course, all right, that space in between our pericardial cavity, the pericardial cavity, which contains the serous fluid, which we need because remember, your heart's beating, contracting, relaxing, pumping, pumping, pumping all the time. And so you would think that that's going to generate some friction in there. And it does, but that serous fluid helps to reduce that friction. So we're not causing damage to our heart. All right, the pleura. When you see pleura, you want to think lungs. All right, same scenario. The layer of the serous membrane that covers the outside surface of the lungs, all right, is the visceral pleura. And then the outer layer is going to actually line the internal surface of that thoracic wall, and that's the parietal pleura. And the space in between is the pleural cavity. Again, that's where the serous fluid is going to be located. If anybody knows of what a pneumothorax is, if we puncture the lung, if you get stabbed or impaled by something, all right, pneumothorax is when this pleural cavity starts to fill up with blood or fluid of some sort. Okay, pneumothorax. See, there's a little pathology your way. So here's a good picture for those. Okay, you can see here, all right, how the parietal and visceral pericardium are pictured here. So that dark blue line that's going right around the heart here, that's the visceral pericardium. That outer blue line, all right, is going to form the sac, all right, that's the parietal pericardium. And then where that light blue is, that's going to be the pericardial cavity with the serous fluid. Okay, same thing here for the lungs, all right, parietal and visceral pleura. All right, so again, just kind of go over these pictures, make sure you understand them pretty well. It'll help you. Now, I don't want you to forget about the other cavity, all right, in the ventral aspect. That's the abdominopelvic cavity. So this is going to be below the diaphragm. All right, so we're going to find the abdominopelvic cavity below the diaphragm. So we subdivide that into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. All right, in the abdominal cavity, that's where we're going to find a lot of organs. All right, pretty much most of the digestive system are kidneys, the ureters, which are the tubes that connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder. And then in the pelvic cavity, okay, that's the lower part or the inferior portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's below the hip bones or the iliac crest, which are the top of the hip bones there. You're going to find, check this out, distal part. What does that mean? This is the last part of the digestive system. So we're going to see the distal part of the large intestine, the bottom portions of the ureters, our urinary bladder, and some of our internal reproductive organs. For ladies, that's where you'll find the uterus and the ovaries. Okay, for the men, we'll find the prostate gland there. All right, then we have our abdominal pelvic cavity. The last, when we're discussing the membranes, we give the name of the serous membrane, we call that the peritoneum. All right, the peritoneum. Same sort of issue here, okay, or concept. The layer that covers the organs is going to be known as the visceral peritoneum. And then the layer that's going to line the internal walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity is going to be the parietal peritoneum. And then in between those two layers is the peritoneal cavity. But look at this term here, potential space. All right. Potential space is a space, all right, that could potentially appear or become present if something happens. If blood somehow gets into the peritoneal cavity, for example, internal bleeding. Okay, so it is a potential space, which means in a normal, healthy individual, right, that space should not be there. Okay, and there's other structures, and we'll talk about them throughout the semester, that have a potential space. So here you can see a mid-sagittal cut of the peritoneum. The dark blue line that's over these organs, that's the visceral peritoneum. And then this dark blue line that lines, all right, this part of the cavity on the anterior portion, that's the parietal peritoneum. And then you can see here, this blue, light blue space, all right, that's the peritoneal cavity, and that's where we'll find our serous fluid. All right, I just want to finish up here talking about the abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants, and then we'll get into some labeling here. All right, there's two ways that we can label, all right, the abdominal pelvic regions. Okay, the first one here is this tic-tac-toe looking structure. Okay, that gives us 9 regions to look at. All right, or compartments. So let's start off with if we're playing tic-tac-toe, let's go to the center X right here in the middle. And you notice that's called the umbilical region. That's because that's where your umbilicus is. What is that? Your belly button or navel. Okay, so what you do is you find the belly button, and that's going to be in the direct center area of this region. Okay, that's the belly button. So if we go above that, up here to the epigastric region, gastric refers to the stomach. That's this guy here. Okay, so most of this region is above the stomach. Epi is above, so we call that the epigastric region. So conversely, if we go below the umbilical region, we call that area the hypogastric region. Yes, it's inferior to the umbilicus, all right, but it's definitely inferior to the stomach. So that's the hypogastric region. Then if you look here, all right, I'm going to put in our umbilicus again. If we go over to these two regions here and here, the left and right hypochondriac region, we're not referring to the person that thinks they have every disease and symptom known to man and thinks that they're sick all the time, all right? We're not talking about a hypochondriac. This term hypochondriac refers to cartilage, all right? So when you see hypochondriac, we're going to be referring to cartilage. And the cartilage that we're referring to are the costal cartilages. What is that? The cartilage that extends from the ribs towards the sternum or your chest bone here. Okay? So the right and left hypochondriac region, all right, is going to be on either side of the epigastric region. Then you can see on either side of the umbilical region, we have our left and right lumbar regions. Well, that makes sense because your lumbar spine, you'll learn later on, sits directly back here. So the lumbar spine is your low back. And on either side of the umbilical region, those are referred to as the right and left lumbar regions. And then finally, on either side of the hypogastric region, we have our left and right iliac regions. Your hip bones, the top of your hip bone, that structure is called the iliac crest, okay? And that's located here. Well, the bone, your hip bone, is made up of 3 bones that have eventually fused together. The most superior bone is called the iliac bone. So that's what these regions are going to be adjacent to, the iliac bones. This is an okay way. It's a pretty detailed way of labeling things. I like this way better. Okay, abdominopelvic quadrants. It's real simple. All right, we find the umbilicus. All right, then we draw a line going up and down and a line going out to either side. And then we can divide the compartments that way. Left upper, right lower, left lower. I think it's way easier to do it that way. And so I find that way to be the easiest. Okay, so that concludes, not class, that concludes the I don't want to call it the lecture material, but I want to get into the labeling. Do you ever post lecture PowerPoints? I'm sorry that I didn't see that, Morgan. No, I do not, and I'll tell you why. I am not allowed to post the PowerPoints due to the American Disabilities Act. And so here's the thing. These PowerPoints are all recorded. If you go to my YouTube channel, you will have those PowerPoints available to you. Okay, they're on my YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see them there. If you want to take notes off of that, you can. All right, but unfortunately, we do not have the PowerPoints. We're not allowed to post those. Okay. And I know that some students have said, well, my other instructors have done that. They shouldn't be doing that, you know. And again, I am not allowed to do that because of the copyright. These are the department's PowerPoints. Okay. I hope that answered your question. All right, so let's do some labeling. If you do, in fact, have your atlas, I would get it out, okay? And let us go over all right, let's go over some of these. Oh, come on now. What am I doing here? Oh, I think my computer's mad at me, y'all. Yes, you can get the atlas from the Greenville Tech bookstore. Someone did contact me today and they told me it's the same. Yeah, you got it right. No. That's you have the right. This is not in there. There's some slides that will be in here. I'll show you. I'll get to those in a second. All right. The second edition, that is, you got the right edition. Okay. If you're not sure, if you go to your Blackboard page, on the announcement page, you'll see a picture of the book and the atlas and the lab manual. So if you have what looks like the lab manual or any of those, then you're good to go. All right, I don't know what's going on with my computer. It's being a punk. All right, no, where are you? Give me 1 second here. All right, now we should be good. My computer's been working hard today. All right. Share screen. Maybe. Okay. There we go. Okay. All right, so here is the anatomical position. Okay, you can see that this person is upright stance, facing us, palms forward. So that means, okay, that the anatomical position for this person, all right, when I say this makes this side the right side and this side the left side, correct? So when they're looking at us, all right, and you'll hear me from time to time say, all right, the anatomical left and the anatomical right. So my right is going to, because I'm facing this person, my right hand is going to be opposite this person's left hand because we're looking at each other. All right. And that's the same thing when you're looking at somebody and you're having a conversation with them and you're face to face, maybe 6 feet apart, social distancing, of course. All right. But you're facing them. And so if you raise your right hand, all right, their left hand is going to be directly in front of you. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. The anatomical position, all right, is going to look like this. All right. Here is what we call the prone position. For anybody that has military experience, if they say get into the prone position or the front leaning rest position, like you're doing a push-up, that blue represents the floor. Okay. So the prone position is basically laying on your face. That's what we're seeing here. All right. In this next picture, we're seeing the supine position. This person's laying on their back. Easy way to remember this is when you're in the supine position, you're laying on your spine, feeling fine. Okay. Supine position, laying on your back. All right, let's jump into the planes here. So you can see here's our person. They're in the anatomical position, and we got our blue plane going right through them. All right, and you can see how it divides them into anterior and posterior portions. Okay, so I'm going to draw a P behind our fella. This is the posterior side. And then an A in front. That's the anterior or frontal portion. Okay, so the coronal plane, and you can use either or, coronal or frontal, right? That's going to divide you into anterior and posterior parts. On our next slide here, this is a transverse or cross-sectional plane. This is sawing the person in half. Okay, and you can see it's going to divide them into superior and inferior halves. Okay, right in the middle there. And then our next plane is the midsagittal. And the midsagittal goes directly down the center of our specimen here. And it divides you into equal right and left halves. Equal right and left halves. Whereas the sagittal plane, you can see here, the sagittal plane will divide you into unequal right and left halves. Or portions, I should say. All right, so the sagittal plane, unequal portions. And then here's a picture of the oblique plane. It's just going through you at an angle, and the angle can vary. 45 is usually the common angle that they use. And that's the oblique plane. Here's a picture that we saw in a previous slideshow. Skip that. We already went through all these. We'll move past that. This is old. These are all the old directional terms. These are in your book. So again, I would definitely make sure that when you were studying for this test, and don't wait to the last minute, I would make sure that you know all this stuff over the weekend. All right, go through all this stuff. All right, if I were to say to you, point to the buccal location, all right, you would point over here to the cheek. All right, go point to the abdominal. That's easy. Abdominal is going to be here in the midsection there. All right, pectoral area, where is that? That's the chest. Okay, so you want to kind of familiarize yourself with that. All right, let's move on. All right, we already saw all this, hypogastric, quadrants. All right. Okay. So let's start going through, and some of these slides will be kind of scattered throughout your lab atlas. So some will be on pages 2 and 3, and some will be scattered further back in the lab atlas. I don't know. It varies. The pages vary. Okay, so you're just going to have to do a little bit of digging here. Don't worry, this is all recorded. So whatever you don't get, you can always come back and watch the video for the labeling. And there are supplemental videos in the course content. And the same thing, Dr. Pernitzer has some of those videos there too. So you have a lot, and you also have some drag and drop exercises that you can do also. So there's lots of ways to go through all this stuff. And I'll have to show it to you maybe next time. Okay. All right. So here's the thyroid cartilage. I know it's cartilage because it is blue, and hyaline cartilage is going to have a blue appearance. Do not confuse thyroid cartilage with the thyroid gland. Okay, you can see here the arrow is pointing to this orange structure with blood vessels. So the thyroid gland is inferior to the thyroid cartilage. All right, the next one that we're looking at is going to be part of the respiratory system. This is the trachea. Do not put windpipe. It's often referred to as the windpipe, but it is not. Okay, the trachea is surrounded by cartilage. Those little blue rings that you see, that again is hyaline cartilage. There's 3 types of cartilage, and hyaline is the most common type of cartilage, right? And that is located, all right, in various places throughout the body, but in this case here, we're seeing it surrounding the trachea, and it prevents the trachea from collapsing on itself. All right, so there's the trachea. The trachea divides, and you have one little tube coming off on the right side. This is an anterior view, so even though this is on the left side of our page, that's the right primary bronchus. So the trachea divides into the left and the right primary bronchi, that's plural for bronchus. So what you're seeing is the right primary bronchus, and you have to be specific. You have to write right primary bronchus or you'll lose half credit. And then here, if you look on the other side, that's the left primary bronchus. And if you notice, the left primary bronchus is a little bit more horizontal than the right primary bronchus. If you're going to swallow something and it goes down the trachea and it's going to get lodged into one of the bronchi, it usually goes into the right primary bronchus because it's more vertical. Okay. All right, so now we're looking at our model here and it's facing us. So the left side of our page is actually the right side of the model. So that's the right lung. And then if you look on the other side, there's the left lung, which is on the right side of our page. Again, this is all related to the anatomical position. Okay, so we saw the left and the right lungs. Then we're looking here at a tube that connects, all right, the throat to the stomach. That's the esophagus. So you can see that tube is going into this J-like structure or organ, and that's the stomach. So that's your tube there is the esophagus. Here you can see it in this model, and I want you to look close to it. Okay, we've taken the heart out of this model. So the esophagus is behind the heart. And you can also see right here, here's the trachea, and then it splits into our left and right primary bronchi. And then right behind the trachea is the esophagus. Here's a simple little hint for you folks. If something is red or if it's blue and it's like a tube, that's probably a blood vessel. This structure is neither red nor blue. This is the esophagus. Please don't get that confused with any other type of structure. Here you can see now that our model, we put the heart back in and it sits right in between our 2 lungs. So that is the heart right there in the middle. Now we'll show you the heart by itself here. There you go. In Bio 211, you will learn all the different structures of the heart. It's fun stuff. All right. Here is your breathing muscle, the diaphragm. The diaphragm makes up the inferior border of the thoracic cavity. It actually divides this thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And there's several holes here in the diaphragm. We'll discuss that in a later chapter. All right, but for right now, when you see this structure, all right, the red represents muscle tissue, and the white is actually a tendon. This whole structure is known as the diaphragm. Makes up the floor of the thoracic cavity. Okay, here you can see the diaphragm in our model here. So above it, you can see the lungs, and then below it, that's the abdominal cavity. And you can see some of the organs in there. You see both the kidneys and the spleen. All right, that's the diaphragm. Now in this model, we zoom out a little bit and you can see the liver. So the liver sits off to the right side of the body and it's immediately inferior to the diaphragm. It's quite a big organ. It's the largest internal organ. All right. Now we'll show you the liver all by itself. This is an inferior view of the liver. Okay, there's a couple structures on here. All right, you only need to know one structure, and that's that green sac. That's called the gallbladder. We'll see that here in a second. Here's the liver kind of off by itself on the right side of this model. You can see the stomach is more on the left side, the liver's more on the right. Here's that gallbladder, it sits on the bottom. The gallbladder's job is to store and concentrate bile. Here's an interesting fact to know. The liver makes the bile and it puts it into the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will store it and concentrate it. So the gallbladder does not make bile. That is a common misconception. All right, this structure right here that you're looking at, that is your stomach. So your stomach has an entrance and an exit. So what that arrow is pointing to is called the cardiac sphincter. And the cardiac sphincter is this ring that surrounds the entrance into your stomach. So your esophagus attaches to this and it empties the food into the stomach. So the cardiac sphincter, again, will close off that opening there. Okay, so pretty much it's this region right here. That's the cardiac sphincter. Okay, so that's the entrance into the stomach. Here's the exit into the stomach. That's the pyloric sphincter. So food will spend quite a bit of time here in the stomach where it starts to become more of a liquid form, gets mixed up, all right? And then when it's time to empty out some of that food into the small intestine, that's where it's going to travel through the pyloric sphincter. That's the exit to the stomach. So you probably noticed that there are these folds, these wrinkles in the stomach, and those are called rugae. All right, the rugae, all right, are going to be the ruffles inside the stomach. So the more and more you eat, all right, and stretch the stomach out, all right, those rugae will start to disappear. Okay, so rugae. And then here's another picture of the stomach overall. All right, enough with the stomach. Let's check out some more stuff here. So the stomach empties into, all right, the small intestine. And the small intestine is made up of 3 sections. The first section is called the duodenum. Some people pronounce it the duodenum. Okay, but that's the first part. So the stomach will empty the food into the duodenum. And that's the first part of the small intestine. So you can see it here in this model. And you can see over here, you have these little ridges in here too. And those are, you don't have to know this, those are called plicae circularis. You'll learn more about that when you do chapter 26 in the digestive system in 211, right? But just think of them as speed bumps. All right, so that's the duodenum. And then the second part of the small intestine is called the jejunum. It's like the middle portion of the small intestine. So the arrow is kind of pointing to the middle there. Again, we call that the jejunum. All right, and then the last part of the small intestine, all right, the third section is called the ileum. That's I-L-E-U-M, ileum. And that's the last part of the small intestine just before it empties into the large intestine. Okay, I'm going to stop here, folks, because it's almost 9 o'clock. I'm sure your brains are full. We've done quite a bit tonight, and I'm really proud of you folks. I don't know how I'm missing when you guys put this stuff up on the chat. It's not notifying me. I will try to be better about that. I noticed a virtual atlas on McGraw. Is this something we are graded on? No. That is, you were not graded on that, but that's something you should look at because there's actual live dissection pictures in there. And again, there's a lot of material and there's a lot of resources out there. So I totally understand that it could be overwhelming. I'm going to stop recording here.